awoke in darkness, momentarily unsure of where I was. Rolling onto my side, I felt for my wife, but her side of the bed was empty. At first, I thought she had gotten up to use the bathroom in these early hours of the morning, but then I remembered her side had been vacant for the last 6 years, and I was alone. Struggling toward consciousness, I realized that I was not in my own bed. Where was I? Then I remembered I was in Washington, D.C., as an invited guest to speak at the presidential inauguration. Turning to the nightstand next to the bed, I glanced at the clock. Soon it would be 6 a.m., and I would be forced to begin my day, surrounded by aides, speechwriters, party loyalists, and dozens of others, all wanting a piece of me. But I still had a little time to hover in that space between wakefulness and sleep, pondering my life, the successes, the failures, the heartbreak, and the void left in my heart by my missing wife. If she could be here, she would be so proud of her husband. Years ago, when I was elected governor, she was thrilled by all the galas and events at the state level. I thought she might need a tranquilizer. You see, my wife was the driving force behind my success. Mary was the one who pushed me to reach higher and higher. I had been perfectly satisfied being a lowly county supervisor, but there was no way she was going to settle for that. Mary wanted to be the governor's wife, or at least a state senator's wife. I rolled over onto my back and thought about how it all began. After 3 years in the Army, I found myself fresh out in 1969. Luckily, I didn't end up in Vietnam. I was sent to Korea instead. Not that I wouldn't have gone to Nam, but I just wanted to live a bit longer. My Army job was a surveyor for the artillery. That sounded pretty safe to me, but upon graduating from survey school, I finished second in my class. I received a pay raise and a promotion. They told me I would be installing the forward observer's positions. I was really proud of the honor and the promotion, until I had that oh moment. The forward observer sat on the front lines and directed artillery fire on the enemy. My job would be to survey and map his location so that fire direction control could plot the artillery fire based on his radio calls. In other words, my new job would put me right on the front lines. So as you can see, I was glad to go to Korea instead of Vietnam. Korea was hot in the summer and cold in the winter. I was assigned to the 2nd Infantry Division's Artillery Headquarters Survey Section. It was actually easy duty. The post was small and located on the side of a mountain. For the entire year I was there, I either walked uphill or downhill. There was no such thing as a flat spot. The only other drawback was saluting. At our headquarters, we had a full bird colonel, 2 lieutenant colonels, 8 majors, etc. You get the picture. The officers multiplied like rabbits as their rank went down. By the time it got down to 2nd lieutenant, we had enough to use as bins. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but there were only about 200 individuals on the post. Being an enlisted man, I had to salute until I felt as if my arm would fall off. So, I was always volunteering for anything that would get me off post and give my arm a break. As I mentioned before, it wasn't such a bad assignment. There were not enough enlisted guys to handle all those extra duties the Army dreamed up, like guard duty, KP, and such, so Korean nationals were hired to do them. That meant we had our evenings and weekends almost free. Okay, big deal, you say. Well, remember that in Korea, certain activities were legal and quite affordable. For a 21-year-old male with no one waiting at home for him, it was like dying and going to heaven. It was summer in Korea, the monsoons had stopped, and the dirt roads and trails had turned from mud to dust overnight, or so it seemed. It was the middle of the week, noon, and I was finished with my day duties. While it might seem I was goofing off, I had actually started at midnight the night before. The North Koreans had moved extra artillery into the demilitarized zone, and I had just returned from the local village at 11 p.m. I had spent a pleasant evening with someone I met there and was feeling relatively sober but very drained and satisfied. For some reason, people in that environment tended to get upset if you were drinking a beer while engaging in casual company. So, the sergeant gathered me and a couple of other guys, and off we went to our side of the DMZ to survey the new guns. Our guys wanted to be able to direct a hit if they were needed. A little description of this area is in order. There are no paved roads here, just dirt paths riddled with wheel tracks and potholes, so driving these roads was a jarring experience. If you were in the vehicle following, the dust was unbearable. I got lucky and was driving the lead vehicle. These roads marked the entry to the DMZ, which was evident when we crossed a long bridge. This bridge had explosive charges placed every 10 feet. If the North Koreans decided to come south, that bridge would be destroyed by the time they reached it. Unfortunately, that would leave all of US north of that bridge with no way back. I began to feel expendable when we finished our survey, rechecked all the computations, and radioed in the results. Yeah, we wanted the North Koreans to know we had them pegged. As we started back down south, the routine felt familiar. It seemed as if the North Koreans moved something at least once or twice a month. I guess they just didn't want us to get a good night's sleep because this happened so often. Since we really couldn't catch some real sleep on post, we were allowed to start our 24-hour passes to the village when we got back. That's the reason I was walking to town. I had a few regular places I visited when this happened. The girls I chose were usually awake by the time I got there, starting their daily routines. This way, I could grab 4 to 5 uninterrupted hours of rest for about $2. On this particular day, it was hot and humid. I climbed onto the bed and fell promptly asleep, not even bothering to pull up the covers. I guess my only attempt at modesty was to sleep on my stomach. After sleeping for 5 hours, I woke up to find Kim sleeping next to me. She was also naked but was lying on her back on top of the covers. I realized that could lead to misunderstandings, so I started gently kissing her. She smelled of bath oil and scented soap, indicating she had visited the bathhouse before coming to bed. That's why I felt pleased when I noticed her responding to my affection. I was brought back from my daydream by a pounding at my bedroom door. I guess they couldn't wait for the desk to process my wake-up call. Then I heard a little voice calling, "Grandpa, can I come in?" It was Samantha, my favorite granddaughter. Just ask her. That's what she tells everyone. Go away. There's no one home. I yelled while putting on my robe. The door popped open, and this little blonde ball of energy dressed in pink jumped up and wrapped her arms around my neck, showering me with kisses before scowling at me. "You forgot your cane," she scolded, and off she went to find it and bring it to me. "Mommy, and I don't want you falling down again and hurting yourself," she lectured. Then I felt old and frail again. I'm only in my 50s but need a cane to help me keep my balance, a result of a stroke 6 years ago. My granddaughter needs to remind me to be careful. At just 4 years old, she seems wise beyond her years. "Samantha, are you bothering your grandfather already?" said my daughter, Danielle, walking into the bedroom. She and her husband, Bill, were using one of the other bedrooms in this suite. This luxury suite is one of the finest in Washington, D.C., completely paid for by my political party. I guess it's one of the perks of reaching the big time in politics. Someone thinks it will impress me, but they don't really know me very well. Grandpa forgot his cane, and I was just getting it for him, the little rascal told her mother. Of course, her mother gave me that look. How many times has she lectured me about just that simple thing? "Dad," she said, grabbing her daughter and starting to leave the room, "get cleaned up because breakfast will be served in an hour." My daughter, Danielle, is so much like her mother. Here I am, one of the most powerful men in the United States, governor of New York State, and she still orders me around. I guess I'll accept her orders because I love her. I picked up my cane and started toward the bathroom, remembering how this all started. It was just before Christmas when I was discharged. The Army felt that I could get home in time to spend the holidays with my parents. My mother was thrilled. Her little boy, at 6 feet tall and weighing 180 pounds, was home safe and sound. Since I had just served my country, I wasn't in any hurry to go back to work. My dad wanted me to join him in the family business, as my 2 younger brothers had. I learned early in life that my dad and I could not work together. You see, there was the right way, the wrong way, and Dad's way of doing everything. My brothers could put up with that, but I never could. All I had to do was pick up a hammer when Dad was around, give it an hour, and we were at each other's throats. I don't mean to give the impression that we hated each other. That was not the truth. We loved each other, but we just couldn't work together or discuss deep subjects. The rest of the time, we were a typical father and son. Since I really didn't have a clue what I wanted to do for a living, I decided that I would draw unemployment while I made up my mind. So off to the state unemployment office I went. One of their rules was the client had to do job interviews while drawing checks. I was sent to the local public utility for my first interview. Just my luck, they hired me. There I was, learning the ropes and customer service. I never did manage to draw an unemployment check. I loved the work. I got to wear a suit and tie and help people with their problems. It sure beat working with my family on dirty construction sites. The veteran employees who had burned out in the job no longer really helped the customers. They basically told people if they didn't like it, they could take their business elsewhere. Neat trick since we were the only company to sell gas and electricity in the area. I resisted that attitude and learned to really work to help the customer. Little did I know how valuable this would be in my later life. Before I went into the army, I had dated one of a pair of sisters. My date was a good Catholic girl, and I got nothing but friendship from her. She had a younger sister who had a boyfriend. The boyfriend, Pete, and I became pretty good friends while we both dated the sisters. When I returned from service, I looked him up. Well, I got the surprise of my life when I finally found him. In the 3 years I was gone, he married the sister, had a new baby girl, and his father-in-law had gotten really, really rich. It seems that his little family business caught the eye of some huge multinational corporation, which bought them for a massive amount of money. Pete was living the good life. Before you ask, the sister I had dated was married, had moved to some exotic location with her husband, and was living off daddy's money. So much for the easy life for me. Pete and I had lunch together and basically brought each other up to date on our lives. I wasn't surprised to receive an invitation to a costume party at his house when October rolled around. I grabbed a girl I was seeing, and off we went. The party was a success, but I did notice that Pete and his wife were traveling in some powerful company. At least half of the guests there were local politicians. It seemed Pete had joined the big time. As the holiday season approached, I found that I was invited to a lot of parties through him. These parties had one thing in common. Republicans and anyone who was anyone in the Republican Party was at these parties. The impressive thing was they actually started talking to me, asking my ideas, impressions, and just making me feel as if I belonged. Me, just a poor working-class guy. On the downside, my girlfriend was a Democrat. Soon I was attending these parties alone. I really don't know how it happened, but all of a sudden, I was going to Republican Party meetings and caucuses. Don't get the idea I was there as an important contributor, unless you count getting coffee, soft drinks, and an extra chair as a major political contribution. But I fell in love with the political process. There it was. At one of these meetings, I saw her. She was beautiful. She had long blonde hair, stunning blue eyes, and a captivating presence. I think I fell in love with her at first sight. Now, she was with a delegation from downstate. They were sent to make sure we locals knew what the party line was and followed it blindly. That was my first taste of party politics. I didn't like it but knew enough to keep my mouth shut around these big shots. I couldn't keep my eyes off my new interest. I knew she was way out of my league. She lived in a section of the state where the average home cost $1 million or better. She spoke with that Ivy League school accent and dressed in outfits that would have cost me a month's salary. I found out later it was more like 6 months' pay. Later that evening, when a downstate representative was lecturing us and being really obnoxious, she glanced over my way with a little grin, as if to say, "Yeah, he's really a piece of work." I agreed with her by a simple nod. I knew I had just made a friend for life. Soon the meeting wound down, and they left in their limo for the airport and their private jet back to New York City. We wouldn't meet for another few years. A few months later, there was an emergency meeting of the local party leaders. It seems one of their candidates was caught by his wife in an embarrassing situation. The meeting was to pick his replacement on the ticket. This particular spot was for a seat in the state legislature held by a long-term Democrat who was not expected to lose. I was in the kitchen area making a fresh pot of coffee when I heard my name being called. I stuck my head out the door and yelled that the coffee was almost ready and that I would bring it out. Well, that brought the house down. They started laughing so hard I was sure I would soon need to call 911 when the local party chairman was able to bring himself under control. He said, "You've just been voted to be our candidate for the Senate seat." After I got back up off the floor, they sat me down and explained why they wanted me. It seems they had been watching me for the last few years and felt I had everything they needed. They also believed I would not win this seat. After all, it was held by a long-term Democrat. However, the experience I gained would be invaluable further down the road. It seems they had plans for me. I started to stutter the reasons why I couldn't accept, but these guys would not take no for an answer. There was no denying it. I had been railroaded into accepting a place on the ticket, so my name was officially on the ballot. Scared shitless was an excellent description of how I felt. Thus began my political career. I was sent all over the district to meet and greet the voters. Now, I really didn't have a clue how to give the chicken in every pot speeches politicos were famous for, so I just started by introducing myself and asking them if they had any questions for me and what they would want me to do. I guess that defined my campaign style. If I was talking from a stage, I'd grab the mic off the podium, sit down with my feet dangling off the edge and say, "Here I am. Let's talk." The voters loved it. They would open up to me and discuss their problems, their dreams, and their hopes. I couldn't solve all their problems, but once a problem was voiced, suggestions popped up all over the audience. There were usually some political activists sneaking into these meetings with the express purpose of disrupting everything, but they didn't succeed. They were shouted down by the people who actually wanted to see the meeting succeed. Sometimes I feared for these activists' safety and waded into the crowd to protect them. Somewhere along the way, I was discovered by the press, and they liked me. They started showing up at my rallies. At first, they kept to the back, just taking pictures and watching. Soon, however, they were asking questions and participating like all the other voters. Needless to say, I usually got good press. When that second Tuesday in November rolled around, I won. I'd like to say it was a landslide, but it wasn't. I won by under 1,000 votes. Hey, New York State was a Democratic stronghold, after all. On the night of the election, I was in my local party's ballroom awaiting the election results when they told me I had a phone call. It was from my opponent conceding the election. He was a class act. We talked on the phone for the next hour and ended up becoming fast friends. As the years went on, I developed my style as a politician. I represented my district in response to their needs, wants, and desires. I refused to play politics. I voted against my party as often as I voted with them. I represented the people, not a political ideology. I was elected to a second term unopposed. During my years in the state senate, I became fast friends with John Bicker, my first opponent. When I was back in my district, we'd meet for dinner, cigars, and a little brandy at his home or his club, and of course, we talked politics. He missed the wheeling and dealing that happened behind closed doors in the Senate. I'd bring him up to date on the goings-on, and he'd fill me in on all the players and how to get around them. He was my best friend, like a second father to me. All these years, I never found a woman to love, a woman to marry, and raise a family with. Oh, there were plenty of women around. I was a man of power, a state senator in the news and on TV. The women were there, but they all ended up leaving me because I just wouldn't commit. Something was always missing in those relationships. One night, after a fine dinner with John, we were sitting on his deck discussing politics, smoking fine cigars, and sipping brandy when he changed the subject. "Why haven't you found a woman yet?" "What?" I was floored by his question. He immediately went into the fine points of having a wife. Besides the cooking, cleaning, and family raising, she would also be a great political asset. Nothing looks finer to the voters than a man and his family standing before them, reflecting their values. I took another puff on my cigar and chased it with a sip of brandy, thinking about what he said. Then I remembered the beautiful blonde woman I had seen many years ago at a political meeting, and my heart skipped a beat. I explained to him how I met Mary, her beauty, her wealthy background, and how she became the standard against which I compared all my other dates. I guessed I still loved her even after seeing her only once. He questioned me about her and the others who had attended that meeting so many years ago. He went on for about an hour, and then his age got the best of him. We said goodnight, and he retired to bed as I showed myself out. Over the next few weeks, I completely forgot about the conversation. About a month later, he invited me to dinner at his club. Since this was about the normal time span between our meetings, I didn't think anything about it. We were deeply engaged in a discussion about a current piece of the budget when I spotted my dream woman walking across the dining room in our direction. She seemed to be looking for someone. Suddenly, John was on his feet, waving his arm and calling out to Mary. When she saw him, her smile lit up the room. She came over to our table and started apologizing for being late. My mentor had set this meeting up, the sly old dog. I already loved him like a second father, and this kindness made me appreciate him even more. Somehow, I managed to remember my manners and stood to hold her chair as she joined us at the table. A wave of John's hand summoned an attentive waiter to take Mary's drink order. By the time her cocktail reached our table, John was halfway through recounting my tale of having seen her all those years ago and how I had been so struck by her beauty. I was certain that Mary could feel the heat of my blush even across the table, and I was mentally evaluating the wisdom of pleading the need to visit the men's room so I could regain my composure when she reached across the table and laid a soft hand on mine. "I guess that's one more thing I owe you for, John," she told him. "I've never forgotten Tom's handsome, rugged face either, and I've had ample time to regret that our respective situations that night denied us the chance to actually meet. Thank you for seeing to it that we have this second chance." At this point, the waiter cleared his throat to let us know that he was still standing by, waiting to take our dinner orders. We quickly took care of that matter, sending him on his way to the kitchen, and then settled into an easy three-way conversation. Somewhere in the midst of that comfortable chat, our meals arrived. I ate mechanically, not really tasting the food. It was as if my body couldn't spare my tongue the necessary attention, my focus solely on Mary. It seemed to me, hopefully my opinion wasn't biased, that Mary was experiencing similar feelings. It certainly appeared that her eyes were glued to me as mine were to her. Eventually, we finished our dinner, and both Mary and I pleaded being too full for dessert, settling instead for an after-dinner drink. John ordered brandy all around and sent our waiter off to procure them. Moments later, he returned with 3 snifters, placed them in front of us, and then leaned down to whisper in John's ear. "It seems that I have an urgent call from one of my clients," John said as the waiter departed. "I'm afraid that I have to leave. Will the two of you please forgive me?" "Of course," Mary smiled sweetly at him. "Go take care of your client. Tom and I will be just fine." "Do you have a way home?" he asked her. "I took a cab to get here," she replied. "I'll get one to take me home when I'm ready, or I could give you a lift," I volunteered. "That would be wonderful, Tom," she nodded. Her smile, however, told me that this was just what she was hoping would happen. "Then I must be going," John smiled. "Have a pleasant evening, you two." With that, he turned and left the dining room. "You do realize, don't you, that there's no client waiting for him?" I asked Mary once John had passed beyond the doorway to the foyer. "Of course," she giggled. "The old dear brought us together, saw that we were getting along well enough, and then bowed out so as not to become an impediment to our getting to know each other better. I'll have to figure out some way to thank him. I'll be calling my tobacconist in the morning." I nodded and said I would have a box of his favorite cigars sent to his office with my sincere thanks. "Then you're a cigar smoker as well?" she asked me. "Guilty as charged," I shrugged, suddenly regretting my comment. "Does that upset you?" "God, no." She shook her head vehemently. "I've been around cigar smoke since the day I was born. Politicians and cigars go together almost as well as coffee and cream." "That's good," I grinned at her, making a point of wiping my forehead in relief with an exaggerated gesture. "To be perfectly honest, I've been known to enjoy a good cigar myself on occasion," she revealed, leaning toward me and speaking in a low conspiratorial tone. "Just not in public. For some reason, society seems to have a negative opinion of women who smoke cigars. I wonder what they would say if they knew that the First Lady indulges," I said, shocked. "You're kidding," I gasped. "Mr. Pat Nixon?" "Oh, not the really big ones that most men favor," Mary shook her head. "They're only just a bit larger than one of those new 100mm cigarettes, but they're most definitely cigars." "How do you know this?" I asked. Dad and the president are old college fraternity brothers, and the president still picks Dad's brain about a few things. We've been invited to informal dinners at the White House a few times. After dinner, the men break out their cigars and head for one of the small drawing rooms while the ladies chat about more mundane topics among friends. The First Lady is a little more relaxed. I was in heaven. Mary was beautiful, charming, and a great conversationalist. She was smart and witty, and she seemed to genuinely like me. If our relationship went as far as I found myself hoping it would, I wouldn't even have to worry about being exiled to the garage or the patio to enjoy my occasional cigar. The evening grew late, and I had an early appearance at the State House the next day. Mary also confessed to having a full agenda planned, though that wouldn't have been the guess of anyone who saw us standing on her front porch. A simple goodnight kiss turned into a lingering moment, and it was fully half an hour before she stepped inside and closed the door gently between us. Not before I managed to secure her promise to have dinner with me again 2 nights later. We started dating, and I fell in love with her. Mary appeared everywhere I was when the Senate was in session. Some days she was in the gallery when I was speaking, other days she was in the lunchroom. She was always there, and I was falling head over heels for her. Mary would often visit my Senate office, and we would spend time together, occasionally getting so caught up in conversation that we would lose track of time. My secretary jokingly claimed that we put rabbits to shame. I always thought we were discreet. There were some days when I could hardly walk back to the Senate chambers, as Mary and I would often be the last people in the building. We were married 1 year later, and with her by my side, I felt complete. Mary became the perfect wife, everything I could have ever wanted. Within 2 years, she gave birth to our daughter, Danielle, and 3 years later, to our son, Tom Jr. She was the perfect wife and mother, standing beside me at political events. The press adored her almost as much as she enjoyed the attention. One day, I received a phone call that my old friend and mentor, John, had died. He was the elder statesman of the state's Democratic Party, and they were doing a tribute to him on primetime television. All the important Democrats were asked to speak, and the Republican Party was also invited to provide a speaker. They asked me to speak at the end of all the Democratic speakers and just before the governor. My party's best speechwriters drafted a spectacular tribute to John, but it comprised only about 10% of my total speech. The rest was pure politics. When it was my turn to speak, I walked on stage to the podium. The setup was elaborate, with multiple microphones and 2 state-of-the-art projection systems, so that I could read my speech without my eyes ever leaving the television cameras. I guess the powers that be had forgotten that the deceased was my best friend because they nearly fainted when I walked up to the stand, removed one of the mics, walked to the edge of the stage, and sat down. The spotlight operators illuminated me as if it was all planned. The television crew was a little slower, and the stage manager pleaded with me to stand up and get on the mark, but I refused. I began my speech by introducing myself and saying, John was my best friend, and I sure will miss him. I'm a Republican, and he was a Democrat, but we never let that get in the way of our friendship. The audience started applauding and didn't stop for several minutes. Once they settled down, I went on to explain our friendship, how he helped me be a better person, helped me understand the political process, and most importantly, how he introduced me to my beautiful wife. My allotted 15 minutes stretched to an hour, and tears flowed freely down my face. Toward the end, I finally concluded my eulogy by looking to the heavens and saying, John, when my time comes, I hope you will allow me to continue being your friend. If they allow it up there, I'd like to continue our after-dinner brandy and cigars. I ended by saying, I'm going to miss you a lot, old friend. At that point, I lost it and broke down crying. My lovely wife ran on stage, wrapped her arms around me, and walked me off stage. They told me later that there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and even some of the tough television anchors had lumps in their throats. The governor then spoke for his allotted time. It was your typical chicken in every pot speech. He wasn't exactly booed off stage, but it was deathly quiet as he walked off. 1 year later, I was elected governor in 1992. I was just completing my first term and preparing to run for re-election. My last 4 years in office were a real learning experience. I'd never thought I would rise this high in the political process, and I had my work cut out for me. I upset some people and moderately angered a few more, but generally, I succeeded in making the state a slightly better place to live. I didn't let the power and glory go to my head. I tried to hold town hall-style meetings every month. My approach of sitting on the edge of the stage and engaging in conversations with the folks created an open dialogue. Everyone attending loved the open conversation and the ability to walk up to me and talk. Everyone but my security detail, who had kittens every time someone hugged me or walked up just to shake hands. About a month before Election Day, my re-election committee decided that my wife should hold a news conference extolling the virtues of one of her favorite charities. So there I stood behind her, offering support for her first time behind the microphone. She read a prepared statement explaining the charity, its goals, and achievements. Then she made the biggest mistake of our lives. She opened the floor to questions from the press. The first few were softball questions asked by reporters who realized she was scared and nervous. Then came the reporter from one of the tabloids, holding a large manila envelope in his hand. I was expecting a hardball question and stepped up behind my wife. Little did I know how hardball it would turn out to be. Stepping up to the microphone, he began by addressing my wife by her first name. Mary, does your husband, the governor, know that neither one of your children is his? To be more precise, they both have different fathers. I have DNA tests proving this. I immediately stepped up to the podium to defend her. When I looked into her face, I could see the horror and shame. It was all true. She looked at me and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Her eyes filled with tears, and then she turned and ran. My world turned black, and I could feel myself falling. I awoke 2 weeks later in a hospital bed, my son and daughter by my side. It seemed I had been in a coma. They were both college students by then, but they looked like they had been through hell. I smiled at them, and my son jumped up, ran to the door and yelled, "He's awake." My daughter began crying. For the next hour or so, I was poked, prodded, and examined by just about every professional in the hospital. Well, maybe not the whole building, but at least on this floor. Finally, they told me what happened. I had had a stroke. It seems a small blood vessel in my brain had decided to spring a leak, resulting in my left side being completely paralyzed. I was assured that with hard work and physical therapy, I would regain most of the usage in my left side. I was devastated. When my children were allowed back in the room, I asked how their mother was holding up under all this stress since she wasn't in the room. They looked at each other, and my daughter said, "We don't know, Dad. She ran off the stage when you collapsed and hasn't been seen since." The memories flooded back from that moment 2 weeks ago, and I cried. The love of my life had gone, leaving me with a hole in my heart that she had once occupied and a nagging question. Why? I'm sitting with my family around the breakfast table, surveying the remains of a very fancy meal. My mind wanders again. I remember the months I spent in physical therapy, learning how to walk, use my vocal cords, and regain the use of my left arm, among other things. My therapy lasted almost a year before I was deemed ready to return to work. Oh yeah, my name was on the ballot again, and the people of the state re-elected me governor. I was still in a coma when they did the deed. I'm just glad my running mate was a very smart woman. She stepped into the job as if she was born for it. About 6 months into my rehab, someone decided it would do my lieutenant governor a lot of good if I appeared at a town hall meeting with her. So, I was placed in a wheelchair and off I went. When I arrived, the hall was already full, and the reporters were lining the walls. Somebody let it slip to the media that I would be there. Sarah, my lieutenant governor, was supposed to hold this meeting and was the first to walk out on stage. The crowd gave her a very warm welcome. She put her speech on the podium and started reading. Well, I wasn't going to let her read to these people. She needed to talk to them. So out on stage I rolled in my wheelchair. The crowd went wild. I rolled up to Sarah, grabbed her carefully prepared speech, and tossed it off the front of the stage. I then took her hand, told her to grab a mic, and we marched, or rolled, to the front of the stage. When I got there, I called out for a chair for her to sit on because we couldn't let a lady sit on the edge of the stage with a skirt on. Too many of the men in the audience might try to look up her skirt. I was going to let her sit on my lap, but then I remembered how big her husband is. The crowd loved it, and Sarah just blossomed. They put her chair down right next to me, and she joined me. I took her arm and put it through mine, picked up the mic and said, "The two of us are a team. If anyone out there messes with her, I'll roll over your toes with my wheelchair." The crowd loved it. I was back in the groove. Then I said, "Sarah's in charge here and doing my job in the Capitol until they make that building handicap accessible." I now had everyone's attention. The next morning, the papers headlined, "He's back and just as sharp as before." We got serious and started the open discussion style meeting. I started off, but soon Sarah took over. She had found her element. All it took was a little push to get her started. I looked around the auditorium and spotted her husband and her teenage daughter. They were smiling from ear to ear. Two prouder people could not be found. At the end of the evening, one of the reporters started asking about my wife and wanted to know how I felt when I found out my children weren't mine. Sarah let him have it, thoroughly addressing his comments. When she was done, I grabbed the microphone from Sarah's hand, tears streaming down my face. I said, "I love my wife. Every night, I pray to God that I get well enough to go out and start looking for her. There is a large hole in my heart that only she can fill. Mary, please come home. I need you." At this point, I lost it and broke down sobbing. Sarah jumped up and pushed my wheelchair off the stage. The crowd began clapping and shouting, "Mary, come home." Sarah helped me while I spoke. I made the 11 p.m. news on all the networks. The next morning, the print media across the country headlined, "Mary, come home," accompanied by pictures of my tear-streaked face and one where Sarah held me while I sobbed my heart out. My political strategists loved it. They assumed I was just saying it to gain favor with the voters. They just couldn't understand I meant it, but deep down inside, I was still asking why. Time went by. I finished my therapy, retaining a somewhat useless left hand, a slight limp when I walked, and a screwed-up inner ear that left me feeling dizzy if I moved too fast. My son moved to North Carolina, met a lovely Southern woman, and started a family. She's due with number 3 in the spring. My daughter married a local boy she met in college, and they soon presented me with a grandchild. Life was good for me now, except for that empty spot in my chest where my heart used to be. "Mary, I still love you." One of my aides walked over to me with a heavy coat for me to wear. "Mr. President, it's time to get started heading downstairs to your inauguration." Bill Jones was a freelance journalist. Most of his livelihood came from filing stories with news services, hoping to be picked up by a publication that would pay him for the rights to use the story. Bill did a series of articles on the spice industry. As the old saying goes, sex sells, and so did his articles. One day, he met a performer named Brandy. He started talking to her and was impressed because she was well-spoken and likely college-educated. She also loved her work. She talked to him about her feelings, describing some of her experiences and how she was discovered by a producer who hired her, allowing her to fulfill her dream. He sat through some of the filming of her scenes, which were exciting. He found that this was a different world. The series of articles sold very well, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt that Brandy reminded him of someone. A few years later, Bill wanted to do a follow-up story on her. He was told that the producer no longer used her because she kept showing up intoxicated. As hard as he tried, he was unable to find her for the story. The producer remarked that it was too bad she burned out so quickly because she really liked her job. A year went by, and Bill was visiting a friend who was dying of cancer in a hospital. Walking down the hall, he looked into the open doors, thinking of all the poor souls waiting to meet their maker. This was where the hospital put their terminal cases. In one room, he saw a woman who looked familiar. He read the name tag, Brandy Hill. He stopped there, remembering all those hours of interviews and how they had almost become friends, how she had disappeared, and how much he could make on selling a sequel. He stopped a passing nurse and asked if he could see her because she was an old friend. The nurse explained that her liver was failing and she didn't have much longer to live. He and the nurse entered Brandy's room. The nurse looked at the chart and explained that Brandy was heavily sedated and would not be waking up for hours. Bill noticed that Brandy's brown hair was blonde at the roots, so he asked the nurse if the color change was due to the drug she was on. The nurse replied that Brandy was a natural blonde. Bill wondered why she had dyed her hair that unflattering brown when blonde looked so much better. Later that afternoon, as Bill sat in a Starbucks sipping coffee and outlining his article, a light went on. He realized why Brandy dyed her hair. He recognized her and took out his cell phone, starting to dial. This was going to be the story of his life. "I've been in office for 2 years now, but I feel as if it's been 20 years. This job is really tough on a person. I spend my days going from one meeting to another, never getting a chance to zone out in between, and I feel as if I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. Right now, I'm in a cabinet meeting. Some days, they just bicker, and I spend the whole meeting acting like a referee. Today was one of those days. I was building up to giving one of the gentlemen a stern talking to when my personal secretary came running into the meeting. 'Your daughter's on your private line,' she said. 'It's an emergency.' I pushed the speaker button and yelled, 'What's wrong?' My daughter's voice came from the speakerphone, and everyone could hear, 'They found Mom, Dad, but she's dying.' They said she only has a week or two left because her liver's almost gone. I looked at my VP. Sarah, you're in charge now. Have the Attorney General draw up the necessary papers so I can resign. The Attorney General started to argue, saying that I didn't need to resign. I could still run the government while I helped my wife get well. The country needed me. I told him to shove it and to draft the paperwork. I was to find out later that he completely ignored my wishes. I turned to my Joint Chief. He was talking on his phone and held up one finger. The general hung up and said, "We can have you in the air in 20 minutes. My people are sending a chopper to your daughter's house as we speak to get her and her husband." God, I love the military. They were always ready for whatever. 6 hours later, I was in LA, in the hospital, walking rapidly down the hall of the critical care unit. I was with my daughter and a couple of Secret Service agents, headed for my wife's room. When we got to her room, we were confronted by a very mean-looking nurse. She sounded like one of my old drill sergeants from the army when she yelled, "Just where do you all think you're going? Just who do you think you are, the president?" I turned and gave her the look. You know, the one I give my staff, my cabinet members, or various members of Congress when I want something done. "My God," she said, "you are him." Then her forehead wrinkled, and you could see the wheels turning in her head. "She's your wife, isn't she?" I nodded. She hugged me and said, "I'm glad you finally found her." She then explained that my wife's health was so poor that the doctors had ordered her to be kept in fairly sterile conditions, all while handing my daughter some gowns and other things to put on. When we were covered, she opened the door and let us into the room, making the Secret Service guys wait in the hall. They actually looked a little scared of her. I saw my wife for the first time in almost 15 years. She was just a shadow of her former self, thin to the point of looking emaciated. Her beautiful blonde hair now an ugly shade of brown and obviously dyed, with the blonde roots showing. She looked at least 20 years older than her 40 years. In other words, she looked like hell. My daughter ran up to her side and said, "Mom, is that you?" My wife's eyes flew open, looking at my daughter. A smile slowly crossed her face, and then the tears started flowing from those stunning blue eyes. The eyes I thought about just before going to sleep every night and again in the morning when I awoke. I knew this was my wife. My heart was complete again. My eyes started tearing up. There were so many questions I had for her, but first, I needed to make her well. My daughter started crying, grabbing her mother's frail hand off the bed, and said, "I love you. Please come back to us. I want you to meet my husband and your granddaughter. Please don't die." At this point, my daughter started to collapse. I was the closest and held on to her until the nurse got to her side. She was taken out to the hall and turned over to her husband and child. I was left standing by my wife's bed, tears running down my cheeks. She turned her blue eyes toward me, sadness showing all over her face. She held her hand up for me to hold and said, "I still love you. I'm so sorry I caused you so much pain." She started to cry. The nurse spoke softly to me from my side. "Let's go outside now. She needs her rest." Another nurse stuck a needle in her fore, and I watched my wife drift off to sleep. I allowed myself to be led outside. I walked out into the hall and into a mess. I guess as president, I really couldn't sneak around without the press finding me, and there they were. The Secret Service, supported by hospital security, was trying to hold them back, but the news media was winning. I raised my hand and said, "There are sick people on this floor. Let's go somewhere we can talk. You guys lead, and I'll answer all your questions." One reporter who looked local yelled, "Follow me. I know the way to the hospital's auditorium." The crowd quieted down and opened up so I could get to the front, and we started walking away. Now, I won't tell you everyone was perfect. One of the local reporters started yelling out questions. He was on a roll until one of the female reporters slapped him across the face and told him to shut up unless he wanted to sing soprano. He got the message and fell very quiet. When we got to the auditorium, someone helped me so I could sit on the edge of the stage. A microphone appeared in my hand, and I smiled and said, "The hole in my heart has healed. It's her, but she's very sick." The flashbulbs started going off, the cameras ground on, and the room erupted into cheers. I found my hand being shaken repeatedly by these cynical old reporters. Some of them hugged me, kissing my face. The head of my Secret Service detail almost had a heart attack until he realized that everyone just wanted to share this special moment with me. I looked around and found I wasn't the only one crying. I guess some of the reporters were not as tough as they pretended to be. When everything settled back down, the news conference went on for the next 2 hours. Whenever a question was asked that I had no answer for, a doctor would appear behind me and take over. I found out that my wife's liver was failing, and she had only a couple of weeks to live. She needed a liver transplant to survive. However, she was also a drug addict, so she was at the bottom of the transplant list. The doctor who was presenting this was asked all about transplants, compatibility, and what was needed for her to qualify for a successful transplant. When the requirements were discussed, a couple of the people in the conference stood and volunteered as donors on the spot. I thought they didn't even know her, and yet they wanted to help. Someone handed me a glass of water at this point, I guess because I was crying so hard that they didn't want me to dehydrate. The hospital administrator took the stage and indicated that my wife was placed at the top of the transplant list. After all, she was the first lady. As soon as a suitable donor was found, they would operate. He also noted that since parts of this news conference were being televised, the hospital switchboard was being swamped with calls from people volunteering to help. As the questions were winding down and news deadlines were approaching, a nurse pushing a wheelchair approached me, saying, "She's awake and wants you with her." The news conference was over. As I was being helped into the chair, I asked everyone there to respect her privacy and not to try to get into her room, as they would only succeed in harming her. I also promised to meet with him every day so we could talk. When I got back up to her room, she talked until she got too weak. We discussed the last 15 years and how much we had missed each other. I updated her on everything the kids had done over those years. I slept in a chair in her room. I was never going to let her leave me again. We talked about our son Tom Jr. I explained he and his wife were expecting number 6 at any time and could not be here but would come out as soon as they could. He wanted to show her his family. She asked me to open her bedside stand and take out the book I found there. It was her scrapbook of all the clippings she had saved. We went through the book, and she asked me about every picture or article she had saved. I explained them all to her, and we both cried. This was the way she had kept up with her family over all the years, and it broke my heart. I guess she really did love us all the time she was gone. The nurse came in and encouraged her to sleep so she could keep her strength up. She also told me that if I didn't stop all the crying, she'd be forced to hook me up to N4 to keep me hydrated. She then smiled at me, patted my head, and told me to get some rest. She would watch over my wife for me. I was awakened by a doctor who wanted to talk to me. He introduced himself as the addiction specialist working with my wife. He then asked if I wanted to hear the story of her life. He said it would be a long, painful process, but he felt that with her children and me standing beside her, she'd make it. However, she needed a lot of help. As I lay in this cheap motel room, paid for in cash to leave no electronic trail of my travels, I began to regret the choices I had made in my life up to this point. I needed a good night's sleep before continuing my journey by bus and train to my secret identity stored in a rented locker in LA. I loved my husband and family. How could I have done this to them? I remembered the reporter revealing a secret I had thought I kept from everybody. I recalled the look of shock and then sadness on my husband's face as I turned to flee. I remembered hearing shouts and seeing people on stage running, not toward me, but toward my husband. I did not look back. I only continued to run. I got to my car and started driving west. Soon, I found myself at a bus station. I went to the convenience store by the bus station and withdrew all the cash that their ATM would allow me to. I bought the necessary supplies to alter my appearance, went into the women's restroom, and transformed myself from a stunning blonde to a mousy brunette with a really bad haircut. I bought a ticket west, starting my journey from being a governor's wife to a homeless person. I disposed of all my credit cards, debit cards, and any other form of ID I carried. I wanted to disappear. I began my 2-week journey via bus and train, north and south and east and west across the country, to confuse anyone attempting to trace me. I used a different name every time I bought a ticket. I stopped at Goodwill stores along the way and bought various outfits to help change my appearance. Eventually, I had to stop and rest. I picked a small town in South Dakota and this cheap motel to recover in. I turned the TV to a news station, looking to see if I was still the lead story. It had been 2 weeks. My deed should have left the front page by now. The news reporters should have moved on from the stories of the wife of a governor to something more important by now. Imagine my surprise when I saw my daughter's face giving a press conference. I turned the sound up and paid attention. It seemed she was saying that the governor, her father, had finally come out of his coma and was expected to recover. His prognosis was very good, and he was expected to recover from his stroke with very few losses. She ended her press conference by looking directly into the camera and saying, "I love you, Mom. Please come home. He needs you." I was crushed. How could she still want me after all I had done to them? I had betrayed her father. She and her brother had different fathers, and I had no idea who the fathers were. I felt like a disgrace. I remembered that day at the news conference when I was fleeing, and everyone on the stage was running the other way towards my husband. I later learned that the stress of my actions had so shocked my husband that it burst a weak blood vessel in his brain. My actions had almost killed the most important person in my life, the man I loved with all my heart. I was in a dry county. There were no bars or liquor stores to help me relieve my pain. I just cried myself to sleep, wishing I had some way to end the hurt. I slept very fitfully, dreaming of how it all began. I was an only child, spoiled rotten by my very rich parents. I had everything I could want: beauty, adoring family, and friends. I ended up having no morals. I learned how to manipulate people to get my way. I really wasn't a very nice person, but I was smart enough to cover it up with dazzling smiles and a charming personality. When I was a senior in high school, I decided that it was time to stop being innocent and start living life. So I picked a boy I felt was worthy of my attention and crossed a line in his parents' living room when they were away for the weekend. Needless to say, I was not impressed with the results. I couldn't understand what the other girls were bragging about. I thought it was nice, but no big deal and kind of messy. It wasn't long before I discovered that the area between was a guy's greatest fantasy. All I had to do was be with him once, and he was my puppet forever. I had discovered power, and I loved it. I graduated with good enough grades to attend any Ivy League college I wanted. My parents wanted me to attend an all-girls school, but I fought that until they relented. So, in the fall, I started at a very expensive co-ed Ivy League school. My roommate was as wild and crazy as I was. We started working our way through the male population at that school. I always enjoyed being with men. It felt good, and I enjoyed the feelings I experienced. We continued this way until we were forced to separate in my junior year. Cindy went home early for the fall recess. Her dad had a heart attack, and she was needed there. Her mother needed her support to get through this crisis. It turned out that it was a very serious heart attack, and Cindy transferred to a local college so she could be near home. I missed her and the nights we spent together a lot. One of the frat boys I knew but had not been intimate with yet asked me to his fraternity's Halloween party. It was a full costume party. I told him I had other plans and couldn't attend with him, but the idea of being able to hide my face and anonymously attend the party started developing in my mind. The more I thought about it, the better the idea seemed. You see, I was always looked upon as a good girl, and I couldn't really let my hair down and get wild. But by hiding my identity, I could be really adventurous. So off I went to a costume rental place to pick out something daring. I found a revealing outfit that fit my body shape perfectly. My next stop was a store where I was able to buy hair color that washed out and some other things to alter my facial features. I went back to my dorm room and practiced changing my features and putting on makeup. After a few hours, I didn't recognize the blonde who stared out of the mirror at me. Once I used the hair dye, no one would recognize me. My next step was to put on the costume and practice taking pieces off to determine what showed. I put on some music and started dancing in front of my mirror, feeling ready for the party next Saturday night. I was excited all week when the weekend finally arrived. The night of the frat party finally came. I had rented a motel room so I could dye my hair and get dressed without anyone I knew spotting me. I took a cab over to the frat house from the motel so that I could leave my car hidden at the motel. I was taking no chances that I would be recognized. When I got to the frat house, I put my mask on, paid the cab, and walked up to the front door. At the door was a guy whose job it was to make sure everybody had a costume on, or they would not be granted access. I was going to like this party. After a few drinks and many dances, including one with the guy I had turned down to attend with, He never recognized me, but in all fairness, his eyes never actually got up to my face either. Someone put that famous stripper song on the sound system, and everybody opened up a space for me on the floor and started chanting to me. By this time, I had consumed a few more drinks than I usually do, so I said to myself, why not? I began moving to the music. To make a long story short, 15 minutes later, I was dancing on a table in my costume, and the crowd loved it. To tell the truth, so did I. I was energized that night. Sometime late in the evening or early the next morning, the party broke up. My new friend drove me back to the motel and helped me gain access to my room. The desk clerk loved my new outfit. After my ride drove off, I drew a bath, soaked myself clean, and washed the dye out of my hair. While soaking, I relived as much of the evening as I could remember. I loved every minute of it, and I knew this would not be my last time. I had a major change in my attitude. I now understood the thrill of the night and wanted to experience it again. After sleeping all Sunday, I returned to my dorm room and promptly went back to bed, skipping all my Monday classes. By the time Tuesday rolled around, I was trying to decide how I could be the star attraction at the next party I attended. I started making plans to create another ID to use when I did attend the next party. Over the next few months, I made friends with a couple of people in the costume and makeup departments at the college. From them, I learned all the tricks to altering my appearance so even my own mother wouldn't recognize me. At any college, there are always banks trying to sign you up for credit cards. I used my forged college ID to obtain a few, then using my fake college ID and the credit cards, I was able to turn them into a driver's license and social security card. I now had the alternate identity of Brandy Hill from California, and my dual life had begun. I finished my last year of college and returned home to start my life. My alternate ID safely established and ready to use. My dad was a staunch Republican and soon had me attending functions with him. Before I knew it, I was hooked by the power of position and anyone associated with it could wield. I began looking for someone with that kind of power to hitch my star to. Soon, I found myself at a caucus meeting in an upstate county. I watched as the downstate leaders lectured the locals on what was expected of them. I noticed a man about my age acting as a gopher, making coffee and refilling waters. He was quite attractive, and I found myself becoming slightly excited. But I also noticed that he was intently listening to everything being discussed, occasionally stopping to whisper in the ear of one local delegate or another. Shortly after the quiet conversation, the representative would ask a very intelligent question or make a deeply thought-out statement. It suddenly dawned on me that he was the real brains in the room, and I was attracted to him. It didn't hurt that he was cute, too. After a while, one of the senior members of my group began speaking in a condescending manner, lecturing everyone in the room. I noticed the gopher was listening, and a small smile crossed his face. I realized he also had filed the man speaking under idiot. I found myself looking over at the gopher, whose name I later found out was Tom. I flashed him a very quick but dazzling smile and winked. He read my actions perfectly and spilled the water he was pouring. I knew I had to get to know him better. Sadly, the meeting abruptly ended, and we were whisked to the airport to return to our homes downstate. I never got a chance to meet this man, let alone pursue anything with him. Little did I know he was to become the most important figure in my life. Time passed, and I managed to make a few trips to the West Coast to submit my alternate ID and become the center attraction at a few group sessions. It took the edge off my excitement. I learned to control these sessions. No longer did I just lay there and be used. I became an active participant, controlling the interactions and enjoying the experience to the fullest. I created my Brandy persona and embraced her to the max. One day, my father urged me to join an old friend for dinner at the Friends Club. The reason was to access the connection between him and an upcoming party member. Little did I know it was just set up to introduce me to the rising star I had seen at that meeting upstate a few years ago, and to see if something developed. When I walked into the club fashionably late, as usual, I heard my name called and saw my father's friend standing and waving as I approached the table. The dinner guest rose and turned toward me, revealing that same handsome, smiling face I had seen years ago at that upstate meeting. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned on the charm. We had a wonderful dinner, and by the time the evening was over, I just knew I had to have this man in my life. No quick encounters for me. If all turned out as I planned, it would be a lifetime with him. So, I started a full-court press, and he never stood a chance. About a year later, we were married, and I was so happy. Little did I know that my Brandy personality would surface again. It was about a year after we married when I started feeling that itch. My other self, Brandy, was beginning to assert herself again. At first, it was just a dream during an afternoon nap while my husband was at the Capitol. Soon, I started making plans to get away for an extended week alone in California and become Brandy again. Over the previous years before my marriage, I had pulled the disappearing act with enough frequency that I rented a storage shed, bought a small car out there, and stashed all my Brandy clothes, makeup, IDs, and credit cards. I would arrive in a taxi, pay off the driver, let myself into the shed, and emerge about an hour or so later as Brandy. My adventures would then begin. Over the years, I had encountered entire motorcycle gangs, groups of guys on pool tables and sleazy bars, street gangs of various ethnic groups, and even construction crews on job sites. Once, I even jumped on a commercial fishing boat and spent 2 days on it. I usually lined up the larger groups for earlier in the week, so I had time to rest. I was in heaven. I don't know how I managed not to contract an STD or face unintended consequences, as protection was never used. I just couldn't get enough. This would be my first trip since being married, so I had to be a little choosier. I couldn't return home with any noticeable marks. I still wanted to be the star attraction at the party. Just before the time for my visit to a friend's house on the West Coast, I made sure I spent quality time with my husband every morning before he left for work and during lunch if he came home. Brandy thought men are so easy to fool. I felt a little regret at my actions, but Brandy ruled, and I left anyway. The week away went perfectly. My Brandy persona managed to participate in 4 group sessions before needing to rest up prior to heading home. It was a very good trip, and Brandy was satisfied. My married personality returned again as dominant, helping me remove my disguise and return to normal before starting back home. When I got off the airplane, there was my loving husband waiting at the foot of the ramp instead of behind the TSA barriers. Being a state senator did have its perks. We met at almost a full run. I threw my arms around his neck, and he lifted my feet off the floor. We shared a passionate kiss, and if it weren't for some of my fellow passengers yelling to get a room, we might have embraced longer right there on the floor. We managed to make it home and didn't get out of bed for the next 24 hours. During one of our rest periods, we were watching the national news, and there we were, captured in our affectionate moment at the airport. I guess someone took our picture. What I thought were stars in my eyes from the excitement were, in reality, flashbulbs. We were described as the senator and his wife, still newlyweds after more than a year. When Tom returned to the Senate chambers, that picture was plastered all over, and he took a lot of ribbing for the next couple of weeks about it. We even made Letterman's top 10 list under How to Greet a Friend, landing at number 3. For the next month, we were inseparable. As the saying goes, absence makes the heart grow fonder. We weren't careful, and I found myself pregnant 2 months later. The next time Brandy surfaced was a few years after our daughter, Danielle, was born. I felt an undeniable urge for another road trip, so I made the plans and disappeared for a week. This time, Brandy ran into a spice producer, and she spent the whole week filming. She loved it and was even compensated for her work. Little did they know she would have done it for free. Years later, she learned that her disguise wasn't as perfect as she thought, which led a reporter to begin his search. He assumed he was watching a lookalike or a distant relative and decided to use his spare time to investigate. The reporter never uncovered her secret. When both kids were older and in school, I began a campaign to have my husband elected to a higher office. Since he wasn't a lawyer, he couldn't run for a higher judgeship, so I set my sights on governor. The current governor was in the other party and was becoming too old to be effective. I knew my husband really had no political ambitions, so everything had to happen behind his back. I ensured that everything he did or said received media attention, sweet-talking fellow Republicans, and doing a little arm-twisting when necessary. It was no surprise to me that he was nominated for the gubernatorial ballot in November against the incumbent. Tom was clueless as to how he got on the ballot and even tried to withdraw his name. But once I threatened no intimacy for 6 months if he did, he promptly forgot all about quitting. My actions reminded me of a t-shirt I once saw, She who controls the relationship makes the rules. Tom's campaign struggled with public recognition in the polls, and it looked as if he wasn't going to make it. It was at this point that Tom's best friend and mentor, a retired Democrat, passed away. Tom was asked to present the Republican tribute to him on a TV special because he was a candidate for governor and was slated to speak next to last, just before the incumbent. On the night of the tribute, everyone spent most of their allotted time criticizing the Republicans and indirectly Tom. I could have cried. They were making him look like a fool. Tom's speech moved everyone to tears, and it took the crowd about 10 minutes to settle down before the governor could begin his remarks. The governor's speech was a typical chicken in every pot address, with little dedicated to John. 1 month later, my husband was elected governor. While not exactly by a landslide, it was a close victory. The sun was up, and the curtains were leaking light in, waking me. However, it was no longer Mary who emerged, but my brandy personality, now in full flight mode. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and began my day, with only one thing on my mind: getting to California and raiding my brandy storage shed to complete my transformation. I knew deep down that I could never return to my past life and family. I packed a backpack with my meager possessions and started walking to the bus station, leaving my merry personality behind in that room, never to be needed again. My brandy persona has starred in many spicy movies, and in between shoots, I work as a stripper and dancer in upscale clubs. This supplies the money for my alcohol and my connection for my cocaine habit. At some of the clubs, various conversations arise about that poor governor and his wife. Brandy never joins these discussions but listens closely. The general opinion is that the man is a hero, too good for any mortal woman, and if his wife is ever found, she should be tarred and feathered. I guess you get the picture. Women can really be cruel. I silently agree with them. It all should be done to me. I deserve it. I read everything the press prints about my former family, and I even keep a small scrapbook with clippings and pictures of them in it. Every time I open it, Brandy cries, usually ending in a deep depression. Sleep on those nights only arrives after I drink at least a quart of something alcoholic. I am not very selective in what I drink. The cheaper, the better. I only want to kill the pain. I slowly lose weight and become useless for the spicy movie circuit, too skinny and always high. I start my downward spiral from upscale gentlemen's clubs to lower-class beer joints and dives where the dancers not only strip but act as escorts between turns on stage. Brandy has aged. It is a hard life that I have been living. I am now in my 40s and not looking very good anymore. It was in one of these bars that we find Brandy dancing. I was just finishing my turn on stage and wearing only my heels. I haven't been feeling well for the last few weeks. I have stopped drinking, only having the $20 drinks served when a customer buys one. And we all know there isn't enough alcohol in those drinks to count. I have also reduced my cocaine usage to just a maintenance level, using only enough to prevent withdrawal. I just feel weak and tired all the time. As I do a backbend, showing the customers everything that makes me a woman, as the music ends, I struggle back up. But instead of stopping when I'm upright, I continue forward off the front of the stage and into the audience, almost blacking out. A bouncer, thinking I'm wasted, runs over to drag me out the door, planning to take me outside and slap me for being messed up again. But it seems that this is my lucky night. The customer whose table I landed on is actually an undercover police officer. He takes one look at my yellow skin and my eyes, starts dialing 911, and flashes the bouncer his badge. The bouncer turns around and volunteers to stand at the door and watch for the ambulance. At the hospital, the emergency room doctor takes one look at me and realizes I'm in real trouble. Back to Tom's story. My political opponents had a field day. They held all sorts of news conferences, calling her the first hooker, the president's personal spicy star. They only stopped when the polls showed they were doing themselves more harm than me. The public was still on my side. They switched tactics, trying to attack me for having her move to the top of the transplant list, but that backfired on them as well. It seemed she was the only person on the transplant list who could use the donor's liver. No other person who needed a liver was a match. The public raised an outcry against these politicians, and my political advisors felt that those complaining would not win re-election. On the day of her transplant operation, the street outside the hospital was so congested with well-wishers that the police shut down all traffic on that road. It was a long operation. I guess they were taking no chances with her health. I was so nervous that I wandered around the hospital, trying to take my mind off what was happening. I found myself standing inside the front doors of the hospital, looking out at a sea of humanity in front of the building. Before the Secret Service could stop me, I was out the doors and in the crowd. Someone handed me a megaphone, and I explained that the operation was still in progress and that they had told me everything was looking good, but I was still scared for her. A big guy walked up to me and hugged me. "We're here to support you, bro. You're the man." At that, he started yelling the Lord's Prayer, and it was soon picked up by the crowd, with everyone reciting the verses. While we were saying the prayer, a nurse in scrubs came running out the door, crying. I looked at her, and she shook her head no. I felt a terrible pain in my chest, and the world went black. It was 1 year later. I was sitting in my wheelchair, talking to my wife. Well, actually, I was talking to her headstone. When the weather is nice, my driver and nurse bring me out to her graveside so I can visit her. God, I missed her. We were so close to being together again when the operation to replace her liver failed. You know the old saying, the operation was a success, but the patient died. I had felt that we could work out all our problems together with the help of a good counselor. People may hate her for all she had done to me, but I still loved her. I almost joined her the day she died, but I guess having a heart attack in the parking lot of a hospital was not the best place if I wanted to join her. But today is different. I have been having chest pains for 2 days, and they are getting worse with every breath. I wish I had said goodbye to my children, but they would have put me back in the hospital. All I want to be is with the love of my life. I turned my head and looked at my nurse and the driver. They were talking and paying no attention to me. My eyesight is getting fainter. I thought I could see her beautiful blue eyes watching for me. The pain started to fade away. Maybe now I would be able to ask her why. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.